Hello, everyone, and thank you for tuning in to our weekly roundup of the main stories on Palestine and the wider region from over the past week. My regular guest, Mouin Rabbani, is away traveling this week, but I am pleased to be joined by Muhammad Shehada, who will be offering his insights on the key stories from the past week. Muhammad, thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me. Great to be back.
Yeah, Muhammad is a visiting fellow with the European Council on Foreign Relations, Middle East and North Africa program. He is a Gazan researcher, a writer, human rights advocate, is very active on social media, amongst other things. And I wanted to do something slightly different to what myself and Mouin have been doing over the past 15 months. Because Muhammad has been following the ceasefire negotiations in Doha and also in Cairo. He's in Cairo at the moment. So I want to use this opportunity to dive deeper into the negotiations that are taking place, with the first phase of the three-phase ceasefire deal coming to an end, I think next week, sometime next Sunday. I think it's a good opportunity to see where we are at this moment. So if I can begin, Muhammad, as I said, with the first phase coming to an end, tell us about the mood in Doha, in Cairo as well, amongst the diplomats, amongst many of the officials that you are able to meet in your travels there. Are they optimistic? Are they pessimistic about being able to enter into the second phase of the ceasefire negotiations without it being derailed?
Thanks so much for this question. I'll start on an optimistic note. So basically, mediators are saying that Witkoff is dead serious about going into phase two, and that he's now holding a more senior status than Mark Rubio or Mike Waltz or any of the lunatics in the Trump administration. So that is a very good positive sign. They say that he's not taking any sort of hubris or malarkey from Netanyahu, and he's very sort of insistent on moving into phase two of the ceasefire deal. There's a lot of negativities around this at the same time. Number one, mediators are warning that Netanyahu is trying to do everything possible to collapse the ceasefire completely, and that he's trying to manufacture consent. He's trying to lay the groundwork for the Israeli public, for the international community to accept the collapse of the ceasefire. Number two, the second concern is that Netanyahu in phase one never fulfilled it in the first place. If you look at the humanitarian protocol that was attached to the agreement, only one item of it was fulfilled, which is food and water, and barely on the sort of the verge. But for the entry of caravans, bulldozers, heavy machinery, the entry of tents, Israel would get an F in a grade in that assessment. For Hamas's side of the negotiations, they are saying that they can still live with this in terms of phase one. It's a C minus for them, but they say we can live with it. And they explicitly say we are very keen or even desperate not to give Israel a pretext to collapse the ceasefire. So they are trying to go to great lengths to make sure that the ceasefire holds. So, for example, Israel, since the ceasefire went into effect, killed over 100 Gazans. Every single one of them civilian, not a single militant. Many of them are children. In the middle of the Gaza Strip, in the central area, as well as in areas that are in close proximity to the buffer zones. In terms of the Rafah border crossing, Israel is not allowing enough people to travel outside. The number that was agreed upon was 250. The number that managing to go out is about 50 or even less per day. It's abysmal in every sense of the word. So that is a huge matter of concern. The other thing, the third concern that mediators expressed as well as negotiators, is that Netanyahu is trying to make phase two, even if he agrees to it, he will make phase two very similar to phase one, no different from it, which means no withdrawal of the IDF from the Gaza Strip. They will maintain the buffer zones. They might withdraw from Philadelphia, but nothing more. And number two, it means no official end to the war. So what the word that mediators have been using is that Netanyahu is trying to Lebanonize Gaza, to turn it into something similar for the next year minimum, where he can launch assassinations, targeted bombings, airstrikes violate the ceasefire as much as he wants and maintain presence on the ground, never withdraw and stay there. So that is the main concern, is that even if Witkoff manages to push Netanyahu into agreeing to phase 2, Netanyahu will never agree to phase 3.
So I just want to point out that we are recording this show on Sunday, 23rd of February. So events may overtake many of what we are discussing. And one of the things you mentioned in your answer is that Netanyahu is doing everything he can to derail the ceasefire negotiations. One of the things that's happened over the weekend is that Israel has refused to release 600 Palestinian prisoners who are part of the exchange. Hamas has released all the hostages it was required of. And not only that, it has said that it is willing to enter into the second phase of a ceasefire deal. So do you see that as being, again, and also I should add the situation unfolding in the West Bank. I think this is the first time in 20 years that Israel has launched an operation with tanks in the West Bank. More than 40,000 Palestinians have been basically ethnically cleansed from their home. They're still within the West Bank, but they've had to give up their houses. So there is another ethnic cleansing or Gazification of the West Bank that is unfolding at the moment. So when you meet with Arab officials, how concerned do they seem to you about what's happening in the West Bank, and also Netanyahu's attempts to derail the ceasefire deals, with what you've mentioned, and also with what's happening over the weekend? As I mentioned, 600 Palestinian prisoners not being released, and the escalation of violence in places like Jenin refugee camp.
Yes, absolutely. It's a very good question. So I'll start first with Netanyahu sabotaging the ceasefire by not releasing Palestinian hostages and prisoners and detainees, administrative detainees. So basically, in that regard, you can see that as soon as Netanyahu got all the living hostages of phase 1 out, he lost all incentive to pursue it anymore. And it's very clear about it. He's not trying to hide it. So there's now only 4 dead hostages that are left in Gaza that are supposed to be released at the end of phase 1 on day 42. Netanyahu doesn't even want to see this coming through. He doesn't want to see it happening. You can see in Israel, with the 4 dead hostages that were released in coffins and body bags and returned there, it was an earthquake for Netanyahu. It slipped under the radar because Israel is using that moment to weaponize it, to sort of dehumanize Palestinians, to manufacture consent to collapse the ceasefire. But the families of those dead hostages and dead captives are refusing to have a single Israeli government official or minister at the funerals of their loved ones. They are blaming Netanyahu explicitly for this. So more hostages coming in body bags is a catastrophe for Netanyahu. He's trying to wiggle his way out of this as much as possible before phase 1 is even concluded. Now, in terms of the West Bank, I was in touch recently with a European senior diplomat on the ground in the West Bank in Ramallah. And he basically said that Israel did this unprovoked, no pretext, no excuse. They're not even giving one to the Europeans. They just jumped at it. They're not trying to justify it. One element of it was Bezalel Smotrich, he, the finance minister, the extremist, messianic, racist, supremacist lunatic, can go on with names as much as you want. He can fit into all these categories. But Smotrich conditioned on Netanyahu agreeing to the ceasefire in return for extending the war goals to the West Bank. So now the war extends not just to disarming, demilitarizing, denazifying, whatever stupid names Netanyahu was using about Gaza, but the West Bank is now part of this. The West Bank is now a war zone. And what they're doing on the ground there, what Western diplomats are telling us, as well as Palestinian activists and human rights advocates on the ground, is that Israel is trying to annihilate, and I use this word without polemics, they're trying to annihilate the refugee camps in the West Bank. So they started now with Jenin. The Jenin refugee camp is no more. It's been turned into another Gaza. It basically, I just asked a colleague from the West Bank that I saw in Doha about this. He said they demolished homes as a cross sign to make new ginormous roads for IDF military vehicles to go through, but that the roads are the pretext. The actual goal is to have the refugee camp no more. And once that is accomplished, they would condition on the Palestinian Authority that they do not rebuild the homes that were destroyed there. And they said Jenin now looks very much like Operation, um, uh, what was the name, 2002, Defensive
Yeah.
Shield, I think,
Yeah.
where when Israel wiped out Jenin and other areas. So 40,000 Palestinians have been kicked out of Jenin and Tol Karim already. Israel is going to do this now to other refugee camps, major ones in the West Bank. I was yesterday having tea with a European ambassador, and he basically said very simple conclusion. He's saying the West Bank is no more. The West Bank in its entirety. He said he used to trek in the West Bank a few decades ago, go on hiking, observing nature. Last time he tried to go there, that was impossible. That was physically impossible because of the amount of checkpoints, settlements, roadblocks, bypass roads, walls, etc. And then his conclusion, and with a straight face, is that Israel is trying to destroy any chance of any solution whatsoever. Not one state, not two states, not autonomy, not even something where you have Palestinians as citizenless subjects of Israeli control, as in East Jerusalem, where they have residence permits but they don't have citizenship. Even that is far fetched for Israel. So the only thing that's left is pushing people now to leave out of Gaza, out of the West Bank. One way that Israel tries to achieve this is pure terrorism, just pure savagery, going in, committing massacres after massacres, terrorizing, destroying, demolishing, in the hope that they would turn people's lives into what Moshe Dayan said in the 60s when Israel occupied the territory. He said, we will tell the Palestinians we have no solution. We will treat them like dogs, and whoever wants to leave shall leave. That is the solution. And that's what you see now playing out very visibly.
What's been your sense from the Arab diplomats you've been speaking to? I mean, when I look at some of them, there seems to be a naivety to think that this is just about Hamas and Gaza. There's always been a plan within Zionism to ethnically cleanse Palestinians and take all of historic Palestine. And West Bank was, after Gaza, West Bank was going to be the obvious target for Israel to expand its, entrench and expand its control and domination of Palestine. Do you think the Arab leaders are aware of the fact that this really isn't just about Gaza and the genocide in Gaza? There's a much broader determination within Zionism to basically expel all of Palestinians from historic Palestine. Do you get that sense that Arab diplomats and leaders are conscious of that fact, that this is, even if Hamas wasn't there, Israel would still seek a way to ethnically cleanse Palestinians? So this really isn't about Hamas. This is really, at its essence, about a Zionist project to expel Palestinians from their land, and they've taken steps throughout history to expand and further entrench their occupation, domination, and control. Are Arab leaders aware of this historical fact or not? Because it's not just Hamas.
Yeah, precisely. They've been saying it even as soon as the war started, as soon as the genocide was unfolding, and Blinken came to Egypt to try to pressure the Egyptian government to allow or to take in Gazans, to empty the Gaza Strip, basically, quote unquote, temporarily. In Hebrew, temporarily means permanent. We tried that with Oslo. It was supposed to be a temporary peace process. That's a permanent status quo now. So the Egyptians immediately understood that that was a scam, and they didn't fall for it. The Jordanians were alarmed immediately, because they understood that if Israel manages to push a single Palestinian out of Gaza into Egypt, they'll do it in the West Bank as well. That is very clear. It's not just based on speculation or analysis. Those Arab countries have long experiences with Israel trying to do this desperately, repeatedly, and systematically. So if you look, for example, at Gaza, Israel, upon its founding in 1948, the Palestinian Nakba, mass exodus, forcible transfer of population to Gaza, Gaza becomes one giant refugee camp. 2/3 of population are refugees, and Israel faces the dilemma there. How do we push the people there beyond the Gaza Strip? How do we push them outside of the refugee camps? Because those refugees, a lot of them kept trying to cross back into their historical villages or their own villages, cross back into their homes to pick up fruits, to be with family, to cross to the West Bank, to cross to other areas. And Israel back then, in the immediate aftermath of the Nakba, 48, they killed about 2,700 to 5,000 Palestinians from Gaza. that were just crossing the fence to go back to where Israel kicked them out of. In 51, Israel tries immediately to hatch up a plan with the United States government to empty out the refugee population in Gaza. And that plan takes shape in 1953, where they make an agreement with the Egyptian government to relocate 12,000 Palestinian refugees from the Gaza Strip into the Sinai Desert. In return for the US paying the Egyptian government about $30 million, which is in today's currency, with the sort of inflation, it would be about $350 million, a huge lump sum. Back then, Israel was trying to simultaneously commit a number of massacres all throughout the Gaza Strip to terrorize people into accepting that plan. So the plan was hatched up 51, endorsed 53. In 53, immediately, Israel unleashes a massacre in the Bureij refugee camp, where Ariel Sharon became the head of a special IDF unit called the Unit 101 that is specialized into two things: going after Palestinian refugees that are trying to cross back into Israel, and going after Palestinian resistance in all its forms, non-violent, violent, peaceful, armed, whatever. So Sharon goes into Bureij and kills 50 people. About half of them were civilians. He goes later on into other areas of the Gaza Strip throughout the years after. It was called the reprisal attacks. He goes one refugee camp after the other, commits massacres to persuade, terrorize people to flee towards Egypt. They don't. Gazans rose in mass in popular demonstrations against this. In 55, they managed to kill it. Then, less than a year later, Israel goes into Gaza, occupies it at the earliest opportunity, and they were occupying it for only 4 months. In those 4 months, they tried to do everything to destroy Gaza and make it uninhabitable. So they destroyed the railway that was connecting Gaza to Egypt. They went into the refugee camps, continued the massacres. They sent thousands fleeing towards Egypt and other areas, and they tried to do it again after the occupation was, after the US forced Israel to end the occupation of Gaza after 4 months. They occupied Gaza again in 67. First thing they do, kick out 12,000 Palestinian refugees, or 11,000 if I remember correctly. Second thing, they try incremental steps that led to the expulsion of about 38,000 Gazans or Palestinian refugees from Gaza, send them fleeing towards Egypt. Israel even opened the Limbi crossing between the West Bank and Jordan, and they provided free shuttles, free trucks and buses to take people from Gaza to Jordan so that they would never return again. And they tried this over and over and over again, and the numbers were in the tens of thousands. In the late 60s and in the early 70s, Ariel Sharon became the head of the Southern Command in the IDF, so he was in charge of the Gaza Strip and the Negev. First thing he does, goes into the refugee camps and destroys thousands of homes. They tried also other incentives that are reminiscent of today. So for one idea that they tried, they opened immigration offices throughout the Gaza Strip in refugee camps, where they offered people foreign passports or pathways towards foreign citizenship, as well as pocket money, the tickets, in return for giving up your Palestinian identity. So your ID card is torn apart, you're not allowed to be a Palestinian anymore, and let's move you to Canada. Only 200 families accepted. They tried other things. They tried, for example, to offer Palestinians in the refugee camps zoned areas within the Gaza Strip where they can build new homes cheaply without having to pay for the land, in return for never returning to the refugee camps in the first place. It also didn't work. So they've been trying this over and over again. Like even in 2004, you had Giora Island, the head of Israel's National Security Council, describing Gaza as, quote, a huge concentration camp, and saying the only solution for Gaza, he was pitching this to the Americans. He said the only solution is to annex 600 square kilometers from the Sinai Desert and push Gazans in there because it's a huge concentration camp. In 2019, you see Netanyahu using the alias of senior Israeli official during a visit to Ukraine, and he said very openly, Israel is actively looking for countries to take in Gazans and to encourage migration from Gaza. And he says that Israel offered those countries to provide the shuttle, the transports, the air flights, and pay for it, pay for all the expenses to relocate Gazans, but they couldn't find any countries at the time. So now they're trying to accomplish what they've been failing to do. Like Bezalel Smotrich once said it, he said Ben Gurion failed to finish the job. So now they're trying to simply finish the job. There's no other way around it. So when people say that Israel's attacks in Gaza are disproportionate or they're going a bit too far against international law, they're missing the point. Israel is not trying to abide by international law. They are trying to follow the textbook playbook of genocide and ethnic cleansing. And in that, they are excelling by far.
You mentioned Ben Gurion. I think it was Ben Gurion who said that the old will die and the young will forget. And unfortunately for the Israelis, the Palestinian new generations of Palestine did not forget and did not wish to live in a condition of ongoing occupation and ethnic cleansing. And it's also interesting that in your response, I mean, most of it was really pre-Hamas. Everything you described was before the existence of Hamas itself. And as many analysts have pointed out, Hamas has provided Netanyahu and Israel, an ideal pretext to justify ongoing occupation. And it's widely known that Netanyahu himself propped up Hamas, and Hamas has been used as an excuse for Israel to entrench and further its hold on Palestinian territories. I want to return back to our initial discussion about the negotiations that are taking place in Doha, in Cairo as well. Last week, there was a summit of Arab countries in Riyadh, where they are trying to put together a post-genocide plan for Gaza. Do we know anything about what this plan will include? I mean, we should say at the outset that there has been a lot of discussion since Trump made the plan, people praising him for thinking outside the box. We've tried everything. And one of the signs of being crazy is that doing the same thing over and over again, and even though it doesn't produce the results. But the thing is, the Arab and the Muslim countries, 54 Muslim countries, have had a plan on the table for Israel since 2002, which is called the Arab Initiative, where all the Muslim countries, all the Arab countries would recognize Israel, a normalized relationship with Israel, in exchange for a Palestinian state in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Of course, Israel has rejected that plan. So when people say we've tried everything, no, we haven't tried everything. There's a clear plan on the table. It has been for more than 20 years. So putting that aside, just going back to the summit in Riyadh at the moment, do we know anything about what this proposal will include and will be offered to Trump, I assume?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are at the moment 3 Arab proposals that have been developed sort of in parallel or simultaneously since the beginning of the genocide. The latest is the one you mentioned, which is mainly focused on governance and reconstruction in Gaza, to show the Americans that there is a pathway to making Gaza livable again within a record time. So it does not take what the UN estimated that it would take up to 17 years to clear out the rubble, 350 years to reconstruct Gaza under Israel's current restrictions or blockade on Gaza that's been there for 17 years. So basically, the Arab countries are trying to say to Trump that we can go in and rebuild Gaza within about 5 years, which would be a record number, but it's not an impossible figure. I have friends in the Gaza municipality, highly specialized in the field. They studied the topic very meticulously, and they say that it can be done even in 2 years if Israel allows into Gaza 1,000 trucks and 1,500 bulldozers. Because right now, in the entirety of the Gaza Strip, there's only 100 trucks, 100. That's why you see, for example, the aid that goes into Gaza, the reason it goes so slowly is because Israel forces truck drivers to dump the aid at the Israeli border crossing, and then forces truck drivers from inside Gaza to come and pick it up. And there's only 100 of them. So it takes a very long time. So with that, if you increase the amount of trucks and bulldozers, can be done sort of like in lightning speed. The other element of the Arab plan that is being proposed by Egypt at the moment and being articulated at an advanced stage is to say that we don't need to move Gazans out of Gaza for reconstruction to happen. There are some areas in Gaza that are still habitable. So, for example, the Nusrat refugee camp, Deir el-Balah, those are 2 areas that Israel didn't go inside with ground troops. They bombed it heavily, but they didn't go inside, so they didn't wreak havoc on it. Gaza City Some parts of it are salvageable. Some parts of it are habitable as of now. There are, for example, specific areas like Zaytun, Sahaba, Tufah, Daraj, some parts of Shijaya, some parts of Sheikh Radwan that have been heavily damaged but not wiped out, like Jabalia or Beit Hanun or Beit Lahia. So the second idea is to establish these areas as safe zones for Gazans to be in, so that Arab reconstruction forces and other countries that would chip in can quickly remove the rubble from areas like Jabalia, Beit Hanun, Rafah, and rebuild it as fast as possible so people can move there again. The third element is pertaining to governance. And there, the Arab countries are proposing a Palestinian police force that is trained by Arab countries. There can also be some training or supervision from the US as well, from the American government, because you saw this with the inspection mechanism that Israel insisted on establishing in the Netzarim corridor. You have right there Egyptian forces, Qatari forces, and then Americans standing in the background. And the reason for that is that Israel insisted. They said, we do not trust any Arab forces to be there on their own. We want Americans to be in the room. So there could be something similar in terms of a local force that is under Arab-American supervision. There's a second plan about the administration of Gaza and how to remove Hamas from governance. And Hamas itself, they say behind closed doors, they told mediators that they made a decision as early as December 2023 not to be in government anymore, to step down and hand it over to the Palestinian Authority, or hand it over to a Palestinian national unity government, or a technocratic independent government. So they gave the three options. The Egyptians proposed a fourth one, to sort of maneuver Netanyahu's veto on the Palestinian Authority's return to Gaza. They proposed an administrative committee of 15 politically independent, technocratic, sort of high competence individuals, prominent individuals that would run in Gaza security, provision of humanitarian services, health, and the economy, the very basic functions of a government, until a Palestinian Authority government is ready to take over. So that's the second proposal that is being put on the table. The third is the one you mentioned eloquently, their peace initiative being updated. So there's now a Saudi Arabia-led coalition called the World Coalition for the Two-State Solution. And they put a vision plan on the table early on in the war that Israel rejected out of hand. Biden didn't interact with it in any sort of meaningful way, didn't publicize for it, but it builds on the Arab Peace Initiative to some extent with some major compromises. So Israel always says that Palestinians rejected the most generous offer in history, Camp David. And in Camp David, Palestinians were offered 90% of the West Bank, not Jerusalem, and Israel would retain control over the airspace, the telecommunication space, the naval space. Israeli restrictions would be still imposed. It was nothing similar to any sort of statehood by far, nothing remotely close to international law. But that is Israel's definition of a generous offer, the most generous offer, they keep saying. But now you have the actually most generous offer on the table in decades, where Arab countries are telling Israel, you would be fully embraced and integrated into this region. You don't have to worry about your survival anymore. You can be completely part of the Arab world, completely normalized relations with every single Muslim country, including Iran, including Indonesia, Malaysia, and other countries that are sort of hostile towards Israel, in return for giving Palestinians 22% of their homeland, only 22%, with even land swaps, like keep the settlement blocks in the West Bank, give Palestinians equal land. Israel didn't even discuss this proposal at all. They rejected it immediately out of hand. It was unthinkable for them.
As I mentioned, I mean, it's quite incredible revealing how many Western commentators, liberals as well, present Trump's plan as thinking outside the box and as though it's irrational. And Hamas obviously has said that it doesn't wish to govern Gaza. That obviously presents a problem for the Israelis, because the pretext of continually torpedoing any kind of negotiation with the Palestinians by using Hamas is no longer on the table. And that I can see how that's causing a problem. I mean, there was a tweet by the former Israeli spokesperson, the British-born was Yon Levy.
Yes.
And he said something so incredible. And I want to get your thoughts on that as a Palestinian, as someone from Gaza. He said, even if there is no Hamas, there is no way of de-radicalizing, in his words, the Gaza Strip, because the Gaza Strip does not have a tradition and a history of liberalism. So where in the case of Nazism, the Germans had a liberal tradition, in his words, he's again providing it just humanizing the Nazis, whereas he's not willing to humanize the Palestinians. He's saying the Nazis had a tradition, or German had a tradition of liberalism, therefore it worked to de-radicalize Germany and have some kind of a peace process afterwards. But with the Palestinians in Gaza, you can't do that, because even if you remove Hamas, even in his term, denazify Gaza Strip, the Palestinians do not have a tradition. So it just shows the genocidal language that's being used and normalized, and how much of a challenge the non-existence of Hamas would present people like Levy and many others, who ultimately, the problem for them is the fact that the Palestinians exist. Not Hamas, but the fact that Palestinians exist. And this was really revealing to me. And I just want to get your thoughts on that.
That's an excellent question. I would say that, first of all, Israelis themselves keep telling me that they see Ilan Levy as a clown, as an embarrassment. But I think that his sentiment here is fairly representative of Israeli mindset. In terms of what Benny Morris has been saying, Israel's sort of foremost historian. Benny Morris says that basically Palestinians can never be brought to accept the two-state solution, to accept losing 78% of their homeland. They can never accept that morally or sort of psychologically. But he says even if they accept it, that's Benny Morris, he says even if Palestinians are brought to morally accept losing 78% of their homeland, that is still unworkable for Israel, because deep in their hearts, Palestinians will keep remembering that they lost the majority of their homeland. So therefore, we should never have a solution with the Palestinians except kicking them out. That's basically the implicit conclusion. Like, he's saying that Palestinians, because of how they would feel about us 100 years from now, even if they have their own state, because we stole their homeland, because we kicked their grandparents out of their homes, that is enough grounds to not grant them any rights whatsoever. Like, I stole your home, you hold a grudge against me, therefore I will steal the shed that is behind the home and the parking lot and the garage and all of it, because you're not going to forgive me for stealing the home. I think that sentiment is purely insane. On the other side, you don't have to sort of speculate. You can look at Palestinian Israeli history around the Oslo peace process. If you just look at interviews of people like Hanan Ashrawi, who stood as a prominent witness to this era, she said that basically it was incredible. Palestinians in Gaza that rose against Israel in sweeping, mass, popular, non-violent demonstrations since 87 up until 93, Oslo, the first Intifada period, they immediately, as soon as the news broke out in Gaza and the West Bank, they immediately went out to the Israeli soldiers with flowers and embraced them. Palestinians are some of the most forgiving people on this planet. And I say that without any polemics. I see it all the time. Like, as soon as they saw a window of opportunity, a window of progress, they were willing to put everything behind them. They were willing to let bygones be bygones and accept that 22%. You only need to look, like with Levy's point, you need to look at juxtapose Palestinian political mainstream versus the Israeli one. In the Palestinian political mainstream, virtually every single political party, every single one of them, has endorsed the two-state solution, including Hamas. Their 2017 charter explicitly says we would accept Palestinian statehood on 1967 borders. They stopped short of saying we would recognize Israel, but that is the same sentiment as Gandhi had towards Pakistan. He said, I would recognize Pakistan's existence as a fait accompli. I will never recognize Pakistan's right to exist. It's a similar moral dilemma, but in terms of any political implication, it does not hold any. If you accept Palestinian statehood, you are by implication accepting Israeli statehood next to you, if that means the end of the conflict. If you look at the Israeli political mainstream at the same time, just split screen, side by side comparison, every single Zionist Israeli political party is now against the two-state solution, and I don't say that lightly. Even the far left, Meretz and Labor, the one that is under Yair Golan, and a former IDF general that's been very proud of holding Palestinians as human shields systematically, never apologized for it, and that called for starving Gazans completely until they return the hostages. He said this is a legitimate argument. Starve Gazans completely, no food, no water, no medicine, no fuel, until they return the hostages. That is now the leader of a party called the Democrats in Israel, a merger between Labor and Meretz. Even that guy, the far left guy, far left relative to Israel, of course, and he says that the two-state solution is a very distant possibility. We should not work towards it at the moment. There's an interview I think he had in Haaretz, if I remember correctly, where he's explicitly saying there's no two-state solution anytime soon. You don't even have to take his word for it. Look at their actions. In Israel's Knesset, there were 2 votes on Palestinian statehood recently. One of them was to oppose any sort of unilateral international recognition of Palestinian statehood or the right to a state. And that passed with 99 Israeli Zionist Jewish political parties. 99. So the only people that opposed it, I think it was about 9 members of the Knesset, which is the Arab parties plus 1 single member, the Ofer Kasef, Zionist, non-Zionist, he's anti-Zionist, communist, part of the joint list of Arab parties. So that was it, the 9. Then they had a second vote about this, and it was not about unilateral recognition or unilateral Palestinian statehood. It was this time about refusing Palestinian statehood in absolute, under any conditions, even through negotiations. And it passed with 68 votes for, only 9 objected. Same 9 Arab members of Knesset and Ofer Kasef. 68 are the Israeli mainstream parties, Labor and the other ones. They just simply refrained from voting. They did not dare to support Palestinian statehood. So if you just put this screen by screen, even during the war, you had 2 Hamas leaders that came out publicly and said, we are willing to put our arms down if Israel ends the occupation. And then you had, I think, Ismail Haniyeh, a couple of weeks into the war, he said, we are ready for a political process. We are ready for negotiating the two-state solution, ready for negotiating an end to the occupation under international law. So that is, from Ilan Levy's perspective now, is seen as Palestinian maximalism. Whereas Israel saying, kick them all out, is seen now as normalized, completely humane sentiment. Like Ilan Levy, he posted something, and I think it was frightening to see what Israeli society ended up, how far they went. Basically,
on that, sorry, Muhammad, on that, I was going to go back to our discussion about Trump's offer and the Arab response. So we will do that. But before I get back to that, because I know you follow the Israeli media quite closely, and many of your tweets is really a translation of the Hebrew articles that demonstrate to people who are not aware the extent to which genocide mania has taken hold of the Israeli public. And it's so normalized the way they discuss the genocidal intent to expel Palestinians from their lands and territories. How much of a gap is there between the way the Western media covers Gaza and just the way the Israelis talk about Gaza, because it's so obvious and so clear when you listen to Channel 14, I think one of the right-wing extreme channels, and the way they discuss Palestinians and what the plans for the Palestinians, and they talk with genocidal intent as though it's just normal discussion. How much of a gap is there between what we are presented by New York Times, Guardian, BBC, and all the other mainstream, and what is actually taking place in Israel, which clearly demonstrate, I think, intent to commit genocide, if there was any doubt?
Yeah, I think the gap is immeasurable. It's completely schizophrenic. It's 2 parallel universes. There's no other way to put it. I basically, as you said, I have a routine. I don't recommend it to anyone. It's painfully tedious. I read every single Israeli newspaper twice, once in the morning, once in the evening, 16 of them, from the very sort of left wing to the very right wing, Channel 14 to Haaretz and others. And basically, I find a lot of very interesting, blatant, openly unashamed admissions of war crimes and crimes against humanity that I then send to journalists that I know in Western mainstream media, word for word. And I say, just translate this. You don't have to write anything of opinion, anything of analysis. Just say, Israel's Channel 12 said this. Or Israel Hayom, the pro Netanyahu newspaper, or the one that Shil Nadelson founded to be pro Netanyahu, is saying this. They are saying that Netanyahu is the reason there is no ceasefire. They are saying Netanyahu is collapsing the ceasefire in phase one. Just translated word for word. And they never do. There's always an editorial decision. There's always other things to justify this. And I see it consistently where Israel says one thing in English and another in Hebrew. It's insane. It's completely bizarre. And it like these, I immediately take screenshots, screen grabs, post it. People find it absolutely moronic that when Western mainstream media is launching the most unprecedented campaign of disinformation by omission, complete propaganda, completely towing the line. Nothing that Israel is saying in its own Israeli media in Hebrew makes its way to mainstream media if it incriminates Israel in the slightest way. Human shields, war crimes, murder, going home to home, killing people. You see these stories occasionally popping up in Israeli mainstream media, not in Western ones. They're completely withheld.
So one of the things Mouin and I discussed last week was the UAE ambassador to Washington, Yusuf Al-Otaiba, who said that, or who he was one of those who praised Trump's plan for, thinking outside the box. But we should point out that in Riyadh, the UAE president, Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed Al Nahyan, was present. And that, of course, raises a question. I mean, there were reports after Yusuf Al-Otaiba made that announcement that the UAE would only attend the summit if there was a changing of the word in issuing any kind of statement. So the UAE basically was opposed to any kind of forced expulsion of Palestinians, but it was not unequivocally opposed to expulsion of Palestinians if Palestinians chose to leave the Gaza Strip. So, but with the UAE president being there, do you know anything more about whether there'd been some kind of a behind the scene deal or any kind of concession made about what kind of statement would be issued, what would be agreed? Because, as I said, Mohammed Zayed Al Nahyan was there, and it seemed like their UAE's presence would be conditional on not taking a really harsh line against ethnic cleansing. So do you know if any concession has been made for them to be in that negotiation?
I'm not aware of particular concessions, but I would say the sentiment of saying this is the only proposal on the table, there's no other proposals or something of the sort. It was voiced also by some European countries. Back in the Trump deal of the century, in his first term, I was around the table when a European senior official from the Middle East peace envoy of the EU, basically someone from his orbit, said very clearly, he said, the Trump plan is a catalyst. We believe that it is a catalyst to move stagnant, still water and generate some creative ideas and push people to think out of the box. And that's a similar sentiment of saying that Trump's plan is meant to force Arab countries to come up with their own plans. I don't think it is. I think that the plan is just being proposed. Trump, as always, either out of lunacy, either to keep the attention on him for a few days, or to basically exaggerate a threat so as to achieve Israeli-Saudi normalization, and in return for taking away that threat that was fictional and non-existent in the first place, or exaggerating a threat to force Hamas to compromise on heavier issues for example, disarmament, demilitarization, disbanding the armed wing, and say that if you do that, we will stop this fictional threat. I was at a conference recently where there were American officials, Arab officials, and former officials. Everyone was clear Trump's idea is unimplementable. Everyone clearly knew that it was just a fantasy. But basically, you have some Arab countries that are trying already to be on Trump's good side, and they try so hard that they end up in this kind of dilemma. They don't want to criticize him publicly. They know the idea is unworkable, unimplementable, and they don't know that it's politically costly to endorse it in any shape or form. It even threatens the national security of multiple Arab countries around Israel, Palestine. But they'd end up with this kind of statement that you saw with voluntary migration versus sort of expulsion. I would say that there's nothing voluntary about it when you give Palestinians a choice between a complete death by disease and starvation or slow death or leaving permanently. That is Moshe Dayan's proposal in the first place. We will treat the Palestinians as dogs, and whoever wants to leave shall leave. Israel treats Palestinians way worse than dogs. Like there's an Israeli journalist, Gideon Levy. He once wrote an article in which he wrote, "We treat Palestinians like animals." And then he got a lot of protestations from animal rights groups in Israel. They sent him letters saying, "How dare you compare Palestinians to animals?" They were shocked, like animals are better. So it's insane. But anyways, so basically at the same time, I would maintain that Palestinians in Gaza should not be treated as cattle to be herded around, but at the same time, they should not be treated as pickles in a jar to be locked in a toxic, uninhabitable space permanently to preserve the Palestinian cause in brine, when the same Arab countries or the same European countries or Western countries that are sort of openly endorsing this have no plans whatsoever of advancing the Palestinian cause. So you end up with something like Palestinian refugees in Lebanon living in very, very horrible, atrocious conditions for the past 76 years without any solution in sight. What I mean by this is Israel is conditioning that any Palestinian that would leave out of Gaza should never be allowed to return to it again. That is criminal, that is illegal, that is atrocious. But at the same time, Palestinians in Gaza, even before October 7th, like any other country, they have the right to go in and out, to leave and return again, to have border crossings that are permanently open. And that is something like, even if these countries want to humor Trump, they should explicitly say that you should force Israel to end the blockade of Gaza. If Israel does not want Palestinians to use its territories to travel outside, then they are obliged by international law to end the air blockade and the naval blockade, so Palestinians can leave by air or sea and return again. If Arab countries can get that concession, that would be commendable, of course, if they can remove the siege. The siege was about locking people in so they cannot leave and locking them out so they cannot return. That is a necessity to remove it. Then people can go in and out and return and travel and back and forth, and investments can pour in. You had that in 2012 when you had some change in the Arab world and Gaza's blockade was half lifted. Back then, basically, a lot of Palestinians from the outside, a lot of Gazans that have never stepped foot in Gaza for decades, were returning to pour in investments and try to make a living or try to make a decent home in Gaza itself. So it could be something similar, movement in two directions. Even before October 7th, you had 50,000 teachers that were unemployable because the market is saturated. Every year when UNRWA or government-run schools open up calls for applications, those 50,000 teachers apply, only about 1,000 of them get hired. The rest are basically ending on the street without a life. There were programs in Qatar, in Kuwait, and in other countries to bring in Palestinian expatriates as teachers or nurses or even construction workers temporarily for a few years, or even if they can manage to make a living and stay there longer. And the sort of remittances they send back to their families there can be very meaningful for Gaza. So something similar would be, like if you look at Jordan's king, Abdullah, when he was sitting with Trump, and he brought up the idea of only taking 2,000 cancer patients from Gaza, Trump's eyes lit ablaze. He was immediately in love with the idea. American diplomats, they tell us behind closed doors that Trump does not have an eye for details. He doesn't care for details. He doesn't want a headache. If you humor the spirit, the essence of what he's saying, you can get along with him very well. And you don't have to humor it completely by the letter of kicking people out permanently. Jordan's idea of taking cancer patients temporarily and then returning them to Gaza is brilliant. So something of the sort. You have 150,000 students in Gaza, university students and high school graduates without any universities left. If you offer scholarships to a substantial portion of them, that is hugely commendable. There were scholarships of the sort before October 7th. But all of this, as long as they can return again, not on the condition that they have to compromise their Palestinian identity, that is not just ethnic cleansing, it's genocide. Because if you push Palestinians out of Gaza, they would see and disperse them to dozens of different countries, they would basically cease to exist as a group. There's nothing called Gazans anymore. They would assimilate into the countries they're in. They would not be allowed to build their own mini Gazans in each country. So that is genocide. You don't have to spill any blood for it. It is the literal definition of genocide.
I mean, I had quite a few more questions about the negotiations, but I think I want to move on now to Gaza and also the West Bank. I mean, there's been a lot of outrage here about the release of the Bibas family funeral. Many in the West saw that as kind of a horrible parade, a dehumanizing parade. Others said, no, it's a procession, it's a sign of respect. And you yourself have been warning about how, months ago, how Israelis will use the tragedy of the Bibas family to torpedo the ceasefire deal. Do you still think that's happening? And also, I mean, someone from Gaza yourself, what is your thoughts on how Hamas have been releasing the hostages? Can you explain why they do it the way they do it? I mean, there was a request by the Red Cross for them to do it privately. Why is it that they don't do it privately? I mean, for many of our viewers, they'd be interested to know, what is the thinking behind that?
Yeah, absolutely. So basically, with sort of these parades, there are many ideas behind it. Number one is basically deterrence. Also, sort of what they call psychological warfare. That Hamas believes if they do this kind of show, it would pressure Israel to basically a number of things. One of them is to see that military options against Gaza will not work, that Hamas is still there undefeated, to show that if the war is resumed, it would not do anything except being a death sentence to the remaining hostages. There's now at least about 25 living hostages left for phase 2. So this sort of clear message, Hamas is undefeated. They will still be there. They managed to recruit as many as they lost, as Anthony Blinken put it. And basically that there is no military option. You have to think about political options. There's the other one. There's an element, I would say, of basically what they themselves see as, from their own perspective, as sort of debunking Israeli propaganda. I do not agree with it, but you don't have to. But basically the sentiment there is that when they show Arab audiences, hostages on the stage, waving or smiling or looking good, they try to meticulously document their state, their mental state, physical state, so that when they return back to Israel, when Israel makes any sort of grand claims that hostages have been ill-treated or tortured or starved or beaten, or any of the treatments that Israel systematically visits upon Palestinian hostages, including raping hostages to death, killing dozens of them in captivity. I think there was about 40 Palestinian hostages kidnapped from Gaza after October 7th without trial, without legal counsel, without visits by the Red Cross, without charges, without suspicions, just kept there as bargaining chips, as strategic assets, as Israel calls them, and about 40 of them tortured to death. So Hamas thinks that these kind of stunts or parades or public processions would prove to an Arab world that Israel's claims are bunk. They're not trying to convince a Western audience anymore because they think that this is a lost battle, that Western media will do its magic, that Western governments, no matter what happens, they will be unmoved. They will not change any position whatsoever. That there are even Hamas leaders from the very moderate wing of Hamas that have been critical of October 7th, critical of Hamas's handling of the war, critical of these processions, critical of the parades, but they don't speak about it publicly basically because they say, and the mediators as well say, the Arab officials were telling us this behind closed doors. They say that if those moderate Hamas leaders, if they criticize Hamas publicly, if they leave Hamas and form a new political party that is demilitarized, disarmed, believes in the two-state solution, recognizes Israel, does everything possible, including security coordination, like the Palestinian Authority, they will not be dealt with by any Western government. They will still be boycotted, sanctioned, and isolated. So if they do any sort of this kind of defection or dissent, they would not win a Western support or legitimacy whatsoever. They will not win an Arab one. You know the region better than I do. And they will lose internal Palestinian legitimacy. That's why you don't see any sort of public dissent or attempts to appeal a Western audience with these parades. Instead, it's targeted at an Arab audience. There's another element of, I would say, deterrence towards other factions in Gaza, including families and tribes that Israel has been arming, supporting, and funding to get them to destabilize, to rebel against Hamas, and to start a civil war in Gaza, not just rebellion, but a civil war. There were a lot of murders happening during the genocide between different families, a lot of fights, a lot of looting by gang members affiliated with ISIS that were in an area under IDF protection. So with these parades, Hamas is trying to send a message that they're still in charge, they're still in control. There's, I would say, another element. There's an element about humiliation, deliberate element about humiliation. And that's what Frantz Fanon said. The oppressed is someone who is sort of having dreams internally about becoming the oppressor, doing to the oppressor what they did to you. And there's an element of that. I recognize it in some of those public processions or parades where Hamas is trying to treat Israeli captives the way Israel treats Palestinian captives, but actually way less. Like you saw at some point, I think Hamas dressed up some Israeli captives in brown uniforms, resembling the ones Israel dresses Palestinian captives in. They didn't beat them up. They didn't sort of hit them on stage. They sort of pulled them to the stage in a sign that they were being forced on the stage, but they didn't do much further than that. If you look at any footage that Israel itself publishes about its treatment of Palestinian hostages, they're basically being intimidated and threatened and forced to keep their heads down, shackled both arms and legs. There's no protestation about it whatsoever.
Forced to wear the Star of David, forced to wear the Star of David, exactly, as we saw last week. Sorry, carry on.
Mm.
And then I should
wearing a shirt that says, there's a shirt that says the Jewish people never forgive and never forget, forcing them to wear that. But there's one last element, the element about revenge, not just there's a slight element of humiliation. There's only one about revenge. For example, you would see Hamas sort of forcing the Red Cross to recognize them as equals, to sit on the same table, to sign papers, to do all this sort of procedural work on camera, on video, to basically sort of humiliate the West or take revenge against the West. They see that the entirety of the Western world, governments-wise, have betrayed Gaza completely, didn't lift a finger to change or challenge the genocide, and they see this as sort of forcing the white man to sit on stage with them by their own terms and conditions, with a Palestinian flag in the background, only a Palestinian flag and nothing more, and forcing them to sign papers and abide by Hamas's rules of the game. So it's a combination of all of these.
Let's end with a question on the West Bank, and it kind of explains much of what you're saying about Hamas doing what it's doing. Because in the West Bank, we don't have Hamas, we have the Palestinian Authority. And the Palestinian Authority is pretty much doing what Israel has been asking it to do, what the Americans have been asking from Muhammad Abbas and others. Despite that, we've seen forced expulsion, ethnic cleansing in the West Bank, and there is a fear that the West Bank is going to be the next Gaza Strip. So despite all that, despite the Palestinian Authority doing what it's doing, the Trump administration has stopped all funding to the PA. So if that really is the case, what does that mean? How significant is that? This seems to be just as much a blow for the Israelis. Israelis have always said that the Palestinian Authority has been a great ally in the sense of being able to crack down on resistance groups, Palestinians who are battling against occupation. So how significant is this defunding of the Palestinian Authority by the Trump administration?
Well, basically, it is incredibly significant. As you said, since the genocide started, the Palestinian Authority took the approach of keeping a low profile, not just sort of keeping their heads down or staying silent, but also to actively try to demonstrate their relevance to the European Union and the United States, enacting a number of dictated reforms. Also, as you said, launching the campaign in Jenin, sort of relinquishing the authority that was in charge of providing benefits to Palestinians that are imprisoned or maimed or tortured or wounded by Israel, as well as the families of those killed by Israel. So they're trying everything possible to showcase relevance and sort of, I would say, like showcase their ability to play along and humor Western expectations and demands. The Palestinian Prime Minister, Mohammed Mustafa, is someone that Europeans like very much. I know that very sort of intimately. They keep telling us about it. And one of the reasons they cite, they say he never talks about the occupation, nothing about politics. He keeps his head down, thinking about practical steps on the ground and the Palestinian economy, improving economic issues, small steps, diplomacy, improving lives, doesn't waste or spend any time on talking about Palestinian rights or about Palestinian self-determination or two-state solution, any of this stuff. So they like him for that reason. But that's the thing, as you said, despite everything the Palestinian Authority did, it's not only unreciprocated, it's not only unrequited, but it is actively humiliated, squeezed, and kept virtually always on the verge of collapse all the time, consistently. I don't remember any day where the Palestinian Authority had surplus where they can invest in other areas. And I would say that has been traditionally the biggest gift Israel and the Western world has given to Hamas. I should at some point maybe write a book about how Hamas wins every argument internally in the Palestinian debate. One of the ways they try to manage the arguments is by simply pointing the finger at the Palestinian Authority and saying, look, what did they get out of doing all this stuff? Why are you asking us to do it? What did they get out of it? For example, like Ghazi Hamad, a guy that Netanyahu and Biden and now Trump like to quote on the issue of doing October 7th again, although he took back that statement, and he basically is very close to a number of international actors and Israeli actors like Gershon Baskin. They've been in touch for decades, and he is someone that has been talking about two-state solution peace. He's seen inside Hamas as a moderate. But even with Ghazi Hamad, when Palestinians tried to push him at some point, and I'm aware of this conversation intimately, when they tried to push him and say, why don't you recognize Israel? Why don't you allow for the two-state solution and endorse it publicly? Why don't you do this and this and this and that? His simple answer was, look at Mahmoud Abbas. He did every one of these issues. He didn't get anything out of it. And he was humiliated more than, he not just like proven futile, but attacked constantly, smeared as a terrorist. Like Abbas, if you just open any Israeli newspaper, not only him, but the Palestinian Authority in its entirety, in Israeli news, in mainstream news, they are constantly portrayed as terror supporters. Although they are actively collaborating with Israel, providing intelligence to the CIA, to Israeli security agencies against Palestinians. Constantly, they're arresting and killing Palestinians. Saib al-Qat said it in one of the leaked files of the Palestine papers. He's saying, we're killing Palestinians for you. We're not getting anything out of it. So this is basically, like, even for the Palestinian peace camp, for Palestinian moderates, they've been so humiliated, betrayed, and smeared by the West and Israel to the extent that many of them shy away from describing themselves as sort of Palestinian peace camps or peaceniks or moderates because you wouldn't gain anything out of it. Like personally, in the war, I got a call from a friend who was doing a PhD in quantum physics, a topic I don't know much about, but a very bright and genius guy. He was doing it at a university called Lund in Sweden. And he's from Gaza himself, Muhammad. He called and said their home was bombed by Israel. One of his siblings was killed. Two others survived. One of them was in critical condition. The other was about to lose his limbs. And he called me Muhammad and cried and begged. He's a man of great pride. He called and begged and begged and begged nonstop. And he said this, he said, you choose, pick and choose which of my two siblings you could save. You get to choose which one of them. You don't have to save them both. Just can choose either of them. And he kept calling and trying and trying. And I tried, and I called virtually almost everyone I know in Europe, in the US, etc. But I didn't get any help. So in that moment, I cannot even face him and look him in the eye, because all my talk for years about the benefit of diplomatic engagement, about the benefit of nonviolence, about the benefit of moderation, evaporated in that instant. I couldn't help in any way at all. I couldn't help any other person in that same way. Like my grandmother, when she was in Gaza, she needed medicine. I couldn't help it. Friends needed tents, food to survive. I couldn't. So all those years of being moderate did not show a single value, any worth whatsoever. And you're constantly attacked as an anti-Semite, as a terror supporter, as whatever names they throw at you. And they've been throwing at Palestinians for almost a century. Like if you look at interviews with Edward Said from the 70s and 80s, he's basically called the same names that are now being thrown at all Palestinians in their entirety. It's insane.
Thank you, Muhammad. That was great, fantastic. Wraps up our weekly review. That was my guest, Muhammad Shehada, joining me from Cairo. Hope you have a pleasant flight back. And thank you for tuning in, and see you next week for another episode of Memo's Weekly Review with me, Naseem Ahmed. Bye-bye.